by the end, when he actually died, I had gotten to a point where I was able to tell his brothers that he had died. And the reason was because as a father, you feel a real obligation to explain the world to your children, like introduce the world, but also explain it. And I realized that death was something that I could not explain. And so I didn't try to explain it. I just told them the truth as best I could.
Welcome, friends, to the 8th season of Bereaved But Still Me. Our purpose is to empower members of our community. I am Michael Liben and the father of 3 children, Idan, Sapir, and Liel. Liel, my youngest daughter, was born with a heart defect and later developed autism and epilepsy. Losing her at 15 is what has brought me here to be the host of this program. Our guest tonight is James Robinson. James Robinson is married to Tali and is the father of 3 sons, Gilad, Yaniv, and Nadav, all of the names which I absolutely adore. In 2017, his article, Road to Recovery, was featured on the front page of the Times Sunday Travel section, describing a road trip his family took after the death of his 5-year-old son, Nadav. The piece was translated into 2 languages, received scores of appreciative comments, and was selected as a notable essay in the Best American Travel Writing 2018. The overwhelming response to the article inspired James to write his book, More Than We Expected, 5 Years with a Remarkable Child, detailing the many gifts of their son's brief but remarkable life and finding strength in the most unexpected places. James, thank you so much for joining us today on Bereaved But Still Me. And let's start with telling us about Nadav.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks so much for having me on. Nadav, as you mentioned, was one of our 3 sons, a twin of his brother Yaniv, and he was born 12 years ago with a very serious congenital heart defect, a single ventricle. And he was a remarkable child. There's a reason that I use that as the title of my book. His condition was exceedingly rare. It needed 3 surgeries by the age of 4, but he had a real remarkable spirit that I think inspired everybody he met. And his life taught me really profound things about what it means to be human. You know, people often talk about birth defects in very guarded tones, like it's something to be ashamed of, like some sort of tragedy. Quite the contrary in our case. Nadav's condition really opened my eyes. It's something that was happening one of the reasons I wrote the book, and made me reconsider how we view the world in a way that I think any parent understands, but especially people with children in complicated situations. You're forced to really confront some things that you don't confront every day, both good and bad. As I said, that was a real privilege.
What are some of the things that you might confront? I mean, I've been there, but maybe some of our listeners don't know.
Nadav was diagnosed in utero before he was born. We knew that his life would be complicated, and we knew that there was a possibility that he wouldn't make it. The medical plan was to try to get him to teenage years where he'd be a candidate for a heart transplant. But I knew when he was born that there would be a chance that I would have to tell his brothers that he had died. And that's a real terrifying thing as a father to have to deal with. At the same time,
for sure.
The reality of his condition really, as I mentioned, opened my eyes to a lot of the world's wonders. The reason that his body formed the way it did is because when he was a tiny embryo, these little tiny hairs on the outside of the embryo didn't beat right and caused a defect in the span of about 3 hours. And it really makes you sort of wonder in the fact that anything works right, that our bodies form the way that they do. And throughout his life, his body was, throughout a lot of medical challenges, was really, really resilient. And the amazing ways in which the body grows and heals is really quite profound. And to watch it in action when a child 3 or 4 years old is recovering from real medical challenges is really inspiring. On top of that, he just had an amazing personality. He was a real charmer. He was an old soul. He was really involved in his medical condition, but he also was sort of a really wise kid, and he was a real privilege too.
I think that sometimes, or maybe often, goes hand in hand. The special kids with the special hearts, they also have special souls. They're wonderfully interesting people. Did you find that?
All 3 of our sons are remarkable in their own way. They all have their own personality.
I didn't mean to take anything away from anybody.
But, it's funny because we had a lot of medical experiences. Nadav endured a lot of really terrible things in terms of the ways in which they had to operate on his circulation and sort of rewire things so that they worked in a way that the rest of us take for granted. And throughout it all, he was very strong. He was very stoic. And he was also very involved. I remember when we were staying in the hospital, our journey, as you know, covered the world. We live in New York, but his home hospital was here in New York. We got stranded on a trip to Australia and spent 3 months in a hospital in Australia. We then had an innovative procedure at a hospital in Philadelphia and spent 6 months there. And throughout it all,
Oh,
Nadav,
nice.
even though he was just 4, was really involved in his care. Like doctors would
Yeah, yeah,
round
yeah.
on him and look at his X-ray, and he would sit there and look at it too. And as people tried to talk down to him with baby terms, he would correct them. He'd use the medical term. Um, so I think he was. I was never quite sure of how aware he was about his medical condition, but I suspect from what we observed that he was actually maybe the wisest one of all of us. And in fact, his body did most of the healing. One of the things that surprised me about being in this situation was like sort of imagine the doctor's role is to heal people, right? That's the
Right.
doctor's role, and you seek out the doctors who can heal your child. And we actually learned a lot from the doctors who took care of him because they viewed their role not as to heal him, but they had a much humbler view that the only person who could heal was Nadav himself. That's what the body does, is it heals. And their role was to give him the best opportunity to do that. And time again, we saw these amazing things happening in his body, the veins in his body rewiring themselves to account for unnatural circulation to the point where
Yeah, yeah.
he was able to walk out of the hospital when nobody even quite knew how his circulation worked. It's really kind of inspiring. So he had kind of this explicit understanding of what was going on, but he also had sort of this inner wisdom about how to live. And I think that that's something that we often take for granted when we heal or when we grow, that it just happens. But there is some like innate force, which is really quite amazing to see in action. And when things go wrong, you see that in its most vivid way.
Well, that's the funny thing because I've often said this about my own children, and we also had great difficulty in having our children. When you think about everything that has to go exactly right, that anybody is ever born or well is nothing short of
I'll
miraculous.
tell you a moment when we found ourselves trying to recover from a family trip gone horribly wrong in Australia. He wound up having emergency surgery and finding himself in a critical care ward. And I remember those first few nights when the doctors came to us with some pretty grave news. There was one night where we were called in for a family meeting. And as you know, having experienced this, like a family meeting is never good. And
No,
you're
never.
surrounded by doctors and there's nurses, and there's all sorts of people there. And then it's you and your wife sitting on a couch staring at this mass of people. And the lead doctor, looked at us and said, I just have to tell you straight out, like, Nadav is not doing well. He's got a high white blood cell count and he's running a fever. And there's 3 things that could happen tonight. There's 3 scenarios. One is that he could get better, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The second thing that could happen is that he could hold steady, and that's what we're hoping for. And then the third thing that could happen is that he could deteriorate. And if that happens, there's nothing more we can do for him.
Right.
And I was shattered into a million pieces, but my remarkable wife, Tali, sat there, just stared her right in the eye and said, so what you're saying is that it's up to him, talking about Nadav.
Yeah.
And the doctor gave her a look and said, yeah, I suppose you're right. And she said, well, I can live with that because I trust him. That was a sort of faith that I had never really considered before. You think externally for faith a lot of the times. You think about a deity or some spiritual answer to the world. But, that was a faith in our humanity and our innate ability to live. And I found that to be, really profound.
Well, I remember one of my mother's heart attacks. She's had, I think, now 3. And this was years and years ago. And they told us to prepare for the worst, that she wasn't going to come out of this. And I just looked at my siblings and I said, Mom will know what to do. And she came back.
And that was one of the hardest things about being his parent, is I knew from the moment he was born that someday I might have to say goodbye to him, and I might have to tell his brothers. And that day did come.
That leads me into the next question that we've learned here over the years about anticipatory grief. And when you learned about Nadav's condition, you were suddenly thrown into the anticipatory grief mode. But also I would consider that the flip side of anticipatory grief is hope. We have the one side of the possible bad news, and we cling on the other side to the good news, right? So talk a little bit about that, about the difference between hope and the ultimate bad news.
Hope was always a tricky thing for me. I don't think I mentioned the word once in the book. And the time that I mention it is when we were sitting in a family meeting where we were told flat out that Nadav would not make it. It turns out that they were wrong in that circumstance. They were right in the long term, but they were wrong in the short term.
Right.
But we just heard this terrible news from this doctor we really respected because he told us the truth. And at the end of the meeting, another doctor raised their hand and said, you shouldn't give up hope. And I looked at her and I said, how could you say such a thing? You've just told me that our son is going to die. How am I supposed to not give up hope? It was sort of a meaningless statement. And it was only much later when I found out that's what doctors are trained to do, is try to not extinguish families' hope. Apparently in medical school, this is something that they talk about a lot. I talked to this doctor who broke the news, not the one who said anything about hope, but the one who sat us down. I said, how do you do that in your perspective? And he said, actually, what I try to train my doctors is to not give false hope. So you can hope that his last days will be comfortable and peaceful and whatever, but false hope would be, hey, maybe he'll pull through, maybe things will magically turn around, maybe that will happen. We did see miracles, but it's sort of to plant that seed in an unrealistic way is a disservice to the parent. The other thing that he said, don't give false hope, be honest and direct, and he said, get the sex of the child right. And I thought that was interesting too, as one of his top three things, and it's true. Because if you don't care enough about the child or the family to know what gender they are, that's kind of an insulting thing, and that's going to drive the barrier wedge between you. So I don't know if hope was really what I felt. I think what I come to realize in the course of his life is that there are some things that I will never understand, and that's what makes me human. That's what makes us human. There is a limit to what we can know, both good and bad. I don't know why we die. I don't know how that's determined. I've always been afraid of it, but I've come to accept it. And at the same time, I don't know why life is so magical and why the body knows to heal itself or grow. And that's something that's wonderful that I don't know about. But I think by the end, when he actually died, I had gotten to a point where I was able to tell his brothers that he had died. And the reason was because as a father, you feel a real obligation to explain the world to your children. Like introduce the world, but also explain it. And I realized that death was something that I could not explain. And so I didn't try to explain it. I just told them the truth as best I could. And I was able to do that. And I think that's what I took out of this experience, is sort of an acceptance that we are at the mercy of some things that we'll never understand. And that's what makes us human. And that's both a terrifying and beautiful thing. And that's just how it is.
You are listening to Bereaved But Still Me. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our program, please send an email to Michael Liben at michael@bereavedbutstillme.com. That's michael@bereavedbutstillme.com. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
James, we both had children with very complicated hearts that required multiple open heart surgeries. And for us, this means that we're given bad news that they need open heart surgery, and then the good news when they survive. And that happens over and over and over again. And this creates a kind of compound grief.
We were in the situation of knowing when Nadav was born that he would need at least 3 surgeries. The plan was to make sure that you could reorient circulation using surgeries at 5 days, 5 months, and then around 4 years old, which would hopefully help him survive till teenage years when he would be a candidate for a heart transplant.
Right.
So we kind of knew the routine in advance. And that's not to say we didn't have setbacks and unexpected things. But we made a promise to his older brother early on that we would be as candid with him as possible about what was happening, even though he was only 4 years old. That actually came from a promise that we made to him when he was old enough to listen. When we said, we'll do our best to be honest with you about things that are happening, because we think you can handle it. And in return, we expect you to be honest with us about things that are troubling you. We'd rather have him come to us be able to talk to us about something frustrating or difficult, and know that we would not get angry. So we made a promise we won't get angry if you tell us the truth. And I think many people think it's a lot for a child to absorb and understand that your brother's born with a heart defect, that he's going to need surgeries, that he might die. But we always felt that kids deserve to know the truth. And over the course of Nadav's life, we learned how super strong and resilient kids are, and how they are able to cope with some truths more than adults are. And I do think they really deserve the respect of honesty and candor. You don't have to go into every single little detail, but I think being honest about the things that matter is really important when dealing with children.
I totally agree with that. My daughter got a pacemaker when she was about 2, and we went through a routine because she was nonverbal. We went through a routine. The heart goes, she'd say boom, boom, boom. And I'd say the pacemaker goes, and she'd say tick, 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 because kind of like a little computer, kind of like a little clock inside your body. One day I asked her, I said, does everybody have a pacemaker? And she said, yeah. And I said, no, actually, it's just you. And I think that scared her because I think for the first time she realized maybe not every kid goes through heart surgery as many times as she had. But we did try to be as candid as possible.
One of the things that's remarkable about other children dealing with it is they do face this stuff very differently than adults do. There was a time when Nadav needed a nasal cannula, extra oxygen, that came from a tech that we carried around on our back, and he had extra oxygen. And adults, when they look at that, they're terrified because if a child needs oxygen, it must mean something is terribly wrong, and they kind of freak out a little bit. And kids, when they look at it, Nadav's peers, when they looked at it, once you explain it to them that he needs extra oxygen to breathe and to live, and gives him the extra oxygen he needs, kids are really at peace with that. Like, they look at that as a really good thing. Wow, he's got the oxygen he needs. That's great that he has that.
I thought you were going to go different with that. And I thought you were going to say, oh, cool, can I have one too?
No, I don't think they go that far, but they accept it in a way that I think adults can really learn from. There is this awkwardness around adults that is often not present with children. Now, that's not to say that kids don't tease each other and so and so. Maybe it's a function of being 5, 15.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of awkwardness around difference that we didn't experience, thankfully. But I think not to be condescending to children about what they can handle is super important because we have a lot to learn.
I totally agree with that. I think kids really are smarter than we give them credit for. And they have a need to understand their world with a certain order. The more you can give them, the more order they can have.
Right.
One of the challenging parts of being a parent of a child with special needs is that you can never go back to the way things were before you had that child. You have a new normal. So tell us about how normal changed for you.
It's funny. We had to cope with not only all the medical stuff, the surgeries, the needs, but we also had to create a normal life for our children throughout all this. And the medical needs were considerable, not just the hospital visits, but when Nadav came home after his first surgery, we had to worry about how to feed him to make sure that he was able to grow like other kids, right? That was a huge challenge. We had to learn how to monitor his oxygen saturations in his blood, which was frustrating because there was a little sensor that went around his toe that kept on falling off. My secret talent is being able to place an NG tube, a nasal catheter tube. And he needed it because kids' cardiac issues, as you know, have challenges growing sometimes. And so he needed supplemental feeds at night. And so we had to put this NG tube in, and it often came out. When we came home, the nurses had to teach us before we left the hospital how to place the NG tube, which was probably the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life, to stick this bright yellow tube down your son's nose. And I'm sorry if you listeners are squeamish, but now you're feeling a little bit of what I felt when I was told I had to do it. And I learned how to do it so well. This is now my secret talent, is being able to put an NG tube in a sleeping baby in the middle of the night without them waking up.
Is there an author in the house who can place an NG tube? Hello. Why, yes.
Well, we laugh about it. But, the reason I laugh about it wistfully almost, is because these are skills that they gave me a certain amount of pride, actually, having mastered them.
Absolutely.
And being able to be the person who is able to take care of your child and knows what they need and is sort of the expert in all this stuff.
Yep.
I have all these other things I picked up. I know how to get stuff done in hospitals, right? Like if you need an echo, I could probably talk to the right people and make sure that it happened today instead of tomorrow, for example.
Yep.
And that becomes part of your identity, and it makes you very proud as a parent to be able to do these things. And unfortunately, one of the many griefs that you feel when you lose a child like this is suddenly these skills rendered useless and irrelevant. It's like losing a limb. Almost.
Yeah, but it's not like you wish you had another child with the same problem so that you could keep doing it. I mean,
no, of course
there is, I think, a certain relief that I know these things, but thank God I don't have to do them anymore.
I don't know if I share that because, honestly, I wish I was still caring for him, obviously. But
well, I understand that, but there is what I meant. I think I maybe should rephrase it. There's a certain release for the child, and there's a certain relief for you that you don't have to live on that edge all the time anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you become used to it. I mean, you really do. I mean, you have, and I think I read about this in my book, about the relationship I had with my wife. A lot of it was centered around his care. That was a really foundational thing in our relationship, right? And then you feel this gaping void when you lose, and everybody grieves differently, even people who've gone through exactly the same thing. You have very different ways of processing grief and dealing with it. And so, I guess it's a relief to not have to deal with it, but it's a tremendous loss. And I think in my experience, that completely overshadows any sort of relief.
I miss her, but my memories of her now are much more easygoing because I don't have on top of that layer of what do I have to do next? When's the next appointment? Where do we have to be? What do we have to do? I can be at home with the memories of my daughter now and enjoy them in a way that I couldn't enjoy being on that edge. And that may only be me. And I certainly don't wish to belittle anybody who feels differently, who's had a loss.
Honestly, to separate out his life from his medical needs, right? They were part and parcel of who he was. So it's hard for me to imagine him without his life, without that aspect of it. And that's part of what I miss, honestly, is that dynamic, because that's part of who he was.
In the ancient days of the internet, when we had these things called listservs, where you could write an email to a group and they would all get it, and then you would be flooded with responses and answers. Somebody asked the question, if I could wave a magic wand over your child and completely cure him, would you do it? And think about your answer, because a lot of people said, no, I wouldn't, because it defines my child. It wouldn't be the child I raised. A lot of people said it would change me. My child defines who I am. If you take away all the care and all the work that we've put in, you've taken away everything. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have an easy answer for that. I wouldn't change any of it, except probably the end. But even that was part of what his life was. His life was what it was. If he had been born differently, he wouldn't have been him, and we wouldn't have been us. And I think that's part of what the acceptance that I talked about earlier is all about, is understanding that as humans, these are things that happen to us. And these are challenges that we all face, some earlier, some later. This is part of what makes us human. And I accept that. I've come to accept that.
We did a program, a couple of programs actually on faith. I'm not going to go there here, but one of the things that we talked about was what you're talking about, I believe, is acceptance as a kind of faith. That I believe things tend to work out the way they should, whether I like it or not. Does that?
Yeah, I changed one word in that sentence, should. I don't know about should. They turn out the way they do. I don't know if there's a should in there.
Interesting.
But yeah, yeah.
Interesting. I can accept that change. Things turn out the way they do. Whether I like it or not, things turn out the way things go.
Yeah, there were a million choices that we made in his life, and some big and some small. There was one really big choice that we made. I'm not sure if you want to talk about it yet, but it's very easy to have regret about the choices you make. And I don't know. I have enough faith in me and my wife's ability to, at any given moment, be as informed as possible about the implications, knowing that there are risks of things happening, to make the right decisions. And if they don't turn out the way that you want them to turn out, that's not your fault. That's just the way life is sometimes. We dealt with some pretty dramatic consequences to our decisions. We got stranded in a foreign country halfway around the world, right? But I don't regret that decision because the reasons that we made it, even if in retrospect they were overshadowed by the consequences at the time, were the right reasons. You have to live in the moment, not live in the past.
If you've enjoyed listening to this program, please visit our website, heartsunitetheglobe.org, and make a contribution. This program is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a nonprofit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to educate, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, hospitals that treat CHD survivors, summer camps for CHD families, and much, much more. So the dominoes began to fall during a visit to Australia. What led to Nadav's passing?
We knew that Nadav would need 3 surgeries. Those first 3 surgeries were planned. They all went relatively well. They weren't run-of-the-mill surgeries. They were heart surgeries, so they're pretty significant. And the third one went a little pear-shaped at the end, and kind of worried for a while there. But he pulled through all those pretty well. It was on a family trip to Australia that we decided to take that he developed a blood clot in his circulation. And that required emergency surgery halfway around the world in an unfamiliar country. Although my mother's from Australia, we have a root there and a lot of family, we found ourselves stranded in this hospital far from home. And his recovery was not assured. The surgery was 14 hours, 10 hours in bypass. It was an emergency surgery. He came out on something called ECMO, which was pretty dire. And he spent 3 months in intensive care in Sydney before my wife discovered a reason to bring him back to the States, which was a doctor in Philadelphia who was doing an innovative procedure that was pretty much one of the only things that could have helped Nadav at that point. He was not a candidate for another surgery. So we arranged this crazy medical evacuation where a doctor, 3 amazing nurses, a medical team came down on a Gulfstream 3 from Philadelphia, making stops in Oakland, Hawaii, and Fiji, Sydney, Australia, arriving in blue jumpsuits with shop transport on the back and American flags on the sleeve, and brought him back to the States, which itself was a risky procedure. They never transported anybody that far, that sick. So it was pretty groundbreaking. And he arrived in Philadelphia, and as soon as we arrived, he underwent this procedure, which allowed us to hope for recovery and not just stability, which was really a blessing. He ended up spending 6 months in Philadelphia. He learned to walk again. He learned to write again. He learned to speak again. He got back on his feet and recuperated for 6 months. And we found ourselves we live in New York, not Philadelphia. So the boys were back home in New York. We split our time between the places.
Yeah.
And it was really a miracle that we were able to get home at all. 6 months after we got to Philadelphia, we finally had a procedure that worked, that allowed him to go home. And even then, though, we knew that things would be difficult. We'd been told that he wasn't going to make it without a transplant, and he wasn't really a candidate for a transplant. He needed a heart-lung transplant, and his body was in pretty bad shape. So even though we tried our best to find a medical solution to it, we kind of knew in the back of our minds that the day might come that he would pass away.
Right.
We got back to New York and enrolled him in kindergarten, which was a pretty incredible thing. That was pretty miraculous. We sent him to public school across the street from our house, which was pretty incredible because they welcomed him in, even though, he was the world champion cardiac kid with an oxygen tank and a nasal cannula. And it was there that we saw the world at its best in many ways, from his teachers and his classmates. And it was really a blessing to see him sort of back home again for real, like a normal kid, albeit under very abnormal circumstances. But we knew that it wasn't sustainable at the end of the day, although we tried to have medical interventions at a hospital near us. It wasn't enough. And that January he died suddenly, but not unexpectedly. And by then I had been through so much in wrestling with the questions of our mortality and the things that we know and don't know, and the world's unknown terrors and wonders that I think I'd learned to cope with it by then. It was a really devastating thing.
Yes.
I was at peace with his life as it was, and I consider that to be a blessing.
We talked about hope a little bit earlier. I think sending him to public school with oxygen tank is, if that's not hope, I don't know what hope is. I just think that's...
Well, I think it was more an insistence. Hope to me implies something beyond our control, and we always tried to bend the world to our will. And my wife in particular was very insistent that he have as normal a life as possible. He had a wheelchair in shop. We didn't bring it home with us. We wanted him to walk. And we sort of felt that if with enough persistence we could achieve anything, and in many ways we did.
I'll accept that. I'll accept that definition. I will. It's just remarkable. Maybe that's the word. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, he was a remarkable kid, but I think all kids are remarkable. And there was nothing, I think, especially remarkable about us. I think we did what any parent in the situation would do. You sort of find yourself in the circumstances you are, and you try your best to make the most of it. And the people we've met are not, I mean, they're all extraordinary people in their own way, but I would like to think that anybody pushed into the circumstance would, as a parent, that's what you do. When a kid is healthy or sick, you do your best you can to give them a good life.
That's for sure. Now, you wrote an article for the New York Times called Road to Recovery about a trip that your family took. Tell me more about that.
I do work at the New York Times, and I'm not a journalist. It was actually really comforting after he died to be surrounded by a lot of remarkable people, especially Jewish people who recognized his name as a Hebrew name and reached out to help us in the aftermath of his death. And it was really comforting. And one of the things that the company did for us is give us the time we needed, both when he was born, when he was sick, and also when he died, the time that we needed to heal. And my wife and I decided that we wanted to cope with, or we decided that one of the things we wanted to do was to get out of town. Traveling was always really important to us as a family, as you might have guessed.
I have.
Trip to Australia with 3 kids, right?
Indeed.
And we sought solace in the open road. So I asked for a month off work, and they gave it to me, which is great. And we hopped in a car and we did the Great American Road Trip. We drove out to the Midwest, a place I'd never been before, all the way out to South Dakota, and then back. There was an eclipse in 2017 that we saw
Oh,
in
awesome.
Missouri.
Love.
We drove down to Charleston, South Carolina. We drove back to New York, a big loop. And we decided that we want to be stressed out on the trip. So we had a couple of ground rules. One of the rules was we weren't going to drive more than 3 hours a day. And then at every stop, we only did one thing in any city. And, it was, as tempting as it was to do more than one thing, and we stuck to it. Like in Indianapolis, we went to the Speedway, right? In Springfield, Illinois, we went to Lincoln's Home. In St. Louis, we went to see the Arch, and it reduced a lot of the stress and pressure.
Yeah.
And we got to experience things that we had never seen. And there's something about like being on the road that I find very comforting and calming. And yet we missed him terribly. And the way we coped with that was everywhere we were, it's a Jewish tradition that when you visit a gravesite, you place a stone on a memorial.
Right.
And we decided that everywhere we went, we would find a stone and we'd pick it up and put it in a bag. So everywhere we went, we picked up a stone. We took a moment to remember him. We wrote down where we were on the date. And then when we got back to New York, we drove to his grave and went to see him. And we took all the stones. And there was one seashell from, I think, Myrtle Beach as well. And I think there might have been a coconut. I'm not sure where the coconut came from. Maybe it was another trip. And we took the bag and we remembered all the places we've been and how much we missed him. And we were there with him too. And that was a pretty special way to remember him.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
The Times encouraged me to write about it, which I found very flattering because I'm not a working journalist, although I do write from time to time. And they published the piece that I wrote about the trip, and it was really well received. And that led to me writing a memoir about his life, which has been published this past November. And that was extraordinarily gratifying to tell our story to people who may have dealt with similar circumstances, or for medical professionals caring for kids like our son, to share our story in the hopes it'll help them is something that I really wanted to do. And the response to it has been very gratifying. And best of all, it gives me permission to return to a world that I unfortunately had been cast out of, communities which I was a part of and now are somewhat irrelevant because I no longer have a son with a medical condition, although he'll always be with us. And so having published the book allows me to have wonderful conversations with all sorts of interesting people, just like I'm doing now. And that's a real gift.
These communities really are tight and last forever. And I appreciate your dilemma there. I do.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that I have this podcast, is to connect once again with all of those people that I knew and so many more people that I don't know or have yet to know. Before we conclude, tell us about your website and how people can find your book.
The book is called More Than We Expected, 5 Years with a Remarkable Child. It's currently for sale on Amazon, major realty retailers, online, independent bookstores. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, just ask them and they'll get you a copy. More Than We Expected is the title. And the website is different. It's morethanamenmoir.com. But the book's title is More Than We Expected. And if you go to the website, there's information on where to find it. And there's also something special that I've set up, which is if you read the book, you'll understand that oregano played a really important part of our son's life.
Okay,
and
now I gotta get it.
People who read the book and want a little packet of oregano to remember it by, I'm happy to send it to you if you fill out the form on the website. And I'll send that out. And maybe that'll bring you a little joy that we felt as well.
James Robinson, thank you so much for joining us here on Bereaved But Still Me and for sharing your thoughts and your story. Nadav was special, and we were able to hear that and feel that from you today. I trust that anybody who reads your book will feel it more to the heart. He clearly was special and remarkable in so many ways. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
That concludes this episode of Bereaved But Still Me. I want to thank James Robinson for sharing his experience and his wisdom with us. Please join us at the beginning of the month for a brand new podcast. I'll talk with you soon, but until then, please remember, moving forward is not moving away.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you have felt supported in your grief journey. Bereaved But Still Me is a monthly podcast, and a new episode is released on the first Thursday of each month. You can hear our podcast anywhere you normally listen to podcasts at any time. Join us again next month for a brand new episode of Bereaved But Still Me.